When we think about the benefits available to our defense personnel, veterans, and their families, the Canteen Stores Department, the CSD, as it's commonly known, it plays a really crucial role, providing access to essential goods at subsidized rates.
Yeah, it's a huge part of their welfare package.
Absolutely.
A real recognition of the service and the sacrifices that they and their families make. And, one of the things we'll be diving into today is a specific area of that CSD benefit.
Right.
And that's the way four-wheeler entitlements are currently structured.
And this is especially important, right? Because when we look at who makes up the vast majority of the beneficiaries, we're talking about junior commissioned officers and other ranks, the JCOs and the ORs.
Right.
And they constitute
97%, a huge...
a staggering 97% of the CSD's population.
Yeah, it's a massive, massive majority. And what's really interesting about the material we've been looking at is that it really focuses on the fact that those rules for purchasing four-wheelers through CSD, they can sometimes create a lot of hurdles for this very group.
Right. And that's exactly what we're going to be unpacking today.
Yeah. Looking at the potential issues, the impact it has on these individuals and their families, and then, of course, exploring some of the ideas that are being put forward to create a fairer system.
Okay, so let's jump right in. One of the things that really jumps out from this material is the limitations around the current entitlements, particularly how it impacts safety. We're talking about those price caps.
Right.
10 lakhs for JCOs, 8 lakhs for ORs. What does that actually translate to in terms of the vehicles available?
So it's interesting because at those price points, beneficiaries often find themselves really limited to those entry-level models. And as you know, increasingly these days, things like airbags, ABS, anti-lock braking system, and electronic stability control, these are considered almost standard safety features.
Right.
And they're often missing from those base models.
It's putting people in a difficult situation where, you're trying to ensure your family's safety on the road, but you're almost being forced to compromise on some of those features because of affordability.
Right. And you can really see how the system, while well-intentioned, might be inadvertently forcing people to make this choice between what they can afford and what's actually best for their family's safety. The report really emphasized that beneficiaries are often having to settle for older models, vehicles that are less well-equipped, simply to stay within those limits.
And it seems like if they decide, okay, safety is non-negotiable, then they get pushed to the open market, which then negates all of the financial advantages that they were going to get through CSD.
That's the real irony, isn't it? That by trying to access that safety, they lose those tax exemptions, those price reductions that CSD was supposed to be offering.
And this leads us to another major point that the material highlights, which is the impact of just market price inflation. Cars are getting more expensive, like so many things these days.
Yeah, absolutely. And that makes those fixed entitlement limits just tighter and tighter over time.
So how are JCOs and ORs managing?
So the material really details how many of them are finding that even just getting a decently moderately equipped vehicle is pushing them beyond those price limits. And then if they do have to go to that open market, as we were talking about, they're suddenly needing bigger loans, they're facing those higher EMIs, the equated monthly installments, and ultimately paying more in interest over the life of that loan. It's a big burden.
It's a huge impact on their household budgets, which I think it's important to remember they're already managing, housing costs, education, and now you add this into it. And it's even more complicated, because when we think about it, JCOs and ORs, they're in a lower purchase bracket within CSD compared to higher ranking officers. So when they're forced to look outside that system,
that disproportionate impact,
it's a much bigger impact.
Really hits home.
And if we think about it, it kind of defeats the purpose of the CSD, right?
Yeah.
This idea of affordable mobility, because the very people it was intended to help the most are the ones being penalized for prioritizing safety.
Absolutely. It's a real catch-22 situation that the material brings to light.
Now, another thing that came up, and this is an interesting angle, I thought, was this disparity in GST benefits. So as we know, vehicles bought through CSD enjoy a reduced goods and services tax rate, 14% compared to the usual 28%. So it's a significant saving, at least on paper. But what's interesting is that entitlement cap prevents many, particularly JCOs and ORs, from taking advantage of this lower GST rate on those safer vehicles.
It's like having a discount, but you can't actually use it on the things you need.
Right.
And what the report argues is that if the entitlement structure was revised, then these JCOs and ORs, they could actually access those better vehicles and still benefit from that reduced GST.
Right.
It raises the question of whether the system, as it stands, is truly doing what it's supposed to be doing.
Maximizing.
Yeah, maximizing those benefits for everyone.
Right.
And it seems like for a big chunk of beneficiaries, it's not.
It's interesting, too, because it's not just about the sticker price.
Yeah, absolutely.
When you think about it, the limited brand and model options are also a factor, right?
Yeah, that came up quite a bit in the material.
So,
you've got those popular SUVs, even some of those premium hatchbacks. The vehicles that might offer better safety, more space for a family, they're simply out of reach because they're beyond those price limits.
Yeah, and sometimes it's not even about wanting a fancy car. It's about practicality.
Right.
What about those vehicles that are known for better fuel efficiency?
Yeah, that's a huge factor.
Or long-term reliability.
And the after-sale service, right. Making sure that if something goes wrong, it can actually be fixed easily.
Right.
And the material indicated that sometimes those vehicles, even though they might be better in the long run, they're just not an option because of those restrictions.
And I guess there's also a logistical element to this, right? The document mentioned that some brands don't have that widespread dealership network within the CSD system.
Yeah, so you could find a vehicle that fits within that price limit.
Right.
But actually accessing it, buying it, getting it serviced, depending on where you're stationed, could be a nightmare.
It's adding those extra layers of complication onto something that should be designed to make things simpler.
Yeah, exactly.
And finally, and this is really where the human impact comes into play.
Yeah.
The document highlights the challenges faced by families,
especially,
and then the post-retirement scenario.
Yeah, when you consider that JCOs and ORs are often posted in areas where there's very limited public transport.
Right.
And a vehicle isn't just a convenience.
Right.
It's a necessity.
It's essential for their families to be able to move around safely and efficiently.
Yeah. And then you add in the fact that when they retire, they lose access to CSD entirely.
They're on their own.
They're on their own.
Forced to buy at those market prices when they're often on a fixed income.
And that could really affect their financial stability, their mobility, their quality of life. It's a big concern.
And I think it highlights this disconnect, right?
Yeah.
Between the service they've provided
and
then the support they receive after they retire.
What's really good about this source material, though, is that it doesn't just point out the problems, it actually offers some solutions.
Right. Let's get into that. What are some of those proposed solutions?
So one of the key ones is this idea of a uniform entitlement for all personnel across all ranks.
Sure. So instead of having those rank-based differences in entitlement, they're saying, hey, let's make it a single uniform amount for everybody.
Yeah, whether you're serving, whether you've retired, everyone's on the same level.
Yeah.
And the argument there is one of fairness. Why should something as important as this, as accessing a vehicle, particularly when we're talking about safety, be determined by your rank?
Yeah, and families have different needs.
Yeah, regardless of rank.
So the idea is empower individuals and families to make those choices based on what they need, what their financial situation is, not where they sit in the military hierarchy.
And the report specifically mentions this would have a huge impact on JCOs and ORs.
Right. Because they are the vast majority of beneficiaries.
Right.
Leveling that playing field, giving everyone that same access.
Okay, what else?
So another proposal really targets pensioners specifically.
Okay.
It's this idea of a higher entitlement limit just for veterans.
Oh, interesting.
And it's acknowledging that they've served, they've dedicated years to the country.
And potentially, a lot of them are in a better financial position after retirement.
Yeah.
The key thing here is they're not saying free vehicles. They'd still be paying that 14% GST.
Oh, okay.
It's about ensuring that they have access to vehicles that really suit their needs in retirement. Maintaining that mobility, independence, quality of life.
It's recognizing that their needs might be different.
Yeah, exactly.
And their financial realities as well.
And that a little bit of extra support can go a long way.
Right.
Now, the third proposal, this is where things get really interesting. It's about moving away from those fixed price-based restrictions.
Okay, so instead of saying a vehicle can only cost this much, what are they suggesting?
The idea is to define GST rates based on the vehicle's engine capacity and the category of the vehicle.
So it takes the focus off the sticker price and it puts it more on the type of vehicle.
Yeah, the specifics of the vehicle.
Okay.
Giving people more choice without all that bureaucracy around price limits.
So really empowering the beneficiary to choose what suits them without being limited by that arbitrary number.
Absolutely.
And if we think back to those challenges we talked about earlier, this really seems to address them, right?
Yeah, those limited model options, not being able to fully utilize that lower GST on a safer vehicle.
Right.
This tackles that head on.
Yeah.
It's about giving people the information and the flexibility to make the best decision for their own situation.
So big picture, what kind of impact would these changes have?
Well, the source material talks about a potential boost to morale and welfare.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big one.
If you feel like the system is actually working for you and it values you, it makes a difference.
Yeah. And having access to safer, more appropriate vehicles can have a real impact on quality of life. It shows those serving families that the government is actually invested in their well-being.
It's a very tangible way of demonstrating that commitment to the well-being of the armed forces.
It goes beyond just that feel-good factor.
Right. What else?
The report also mentions potential economic benefits.
Okay.
Increased automobile sales, which is good for manufacturers. Good for the economy as a whole.
Right.
And then, of course, there's that aspect of ensuring that defense personnel are getting value for their money by purchasing through CSD.
It's a system that can work for everyone if it's optimized.
And I think ultimately what the material emphasizes is that these policy updates are a way of showing that the government truly values the sacrifices and the service of the defense community. It's about recognizing that things change, needs evolve, and these welfare initiatives need to adapt to that.
So summing up, we've really delved into how the CSD four-wheeler entitlement system, particularly those price caps, they're creating obstacles for JCOs and ORs. We're talking affordability, market inflation, GST disparities,
limited choices, and even challenges after retirement.
All very real issues.
And those proposed solutions. A uniform entitlement, a higher entitlement for pensioners, and moving away from those fixed price limits, they offer a real chance to create a system that's fair and effective.
A system that actually supports the well-being of the people it's designed to serve.
That's the goal.
And I think it really makes you think, doesn't it, when we talk about the sacrifices made by our defense personnel and the importance of supporting their well-being. Something like a vehicle entitlement policy might seem like a very specific thing, but it can have such a huge impact.
Absolutely.
On their lives, on their families, and even on morale.
And it makes you wonder how other welfare initiatives could be adjusted, could be updated to better serve those who serve us all.
It's a conversation worth having. So, lots to think about there. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive.
Yeah, it's been a really insightful look at a really important topic. Thanks for having me.